SOS was one of the most intelligent and talented Protoss players in StarCraft 2 history. This was a guy that really understood the race of Protoss and understood how to plan for, execute, and win a best of series, a best of 5 or a best of 7, better than almost anyone in the history of the game. He was on an MVP level when it came to truly understanding the mind games and the dynamics behind planning a series in an RTS game. And when I say MVP, I mean the Korean Terran player, not most valuable player. MVP truly understood what it took to rattle an opponent or play to their weaknesses and really execute the strategy that would set you up to do a build or an idea or a strategy in the next game. He understood the cascading effect of showing a guy a cheese in game 1 and how he might rattle or it might alter his play. He understood playing to the map, and he understood the creative element of making up builds, executing on dudes, and SOS was a big-time tournament winner. This was a guy who famously won this really goofy IEM tournament in 2014 where the entire 100k plus prize pool was just to first place, where obviously like every other esports tournament in history has distributed payouts. The guy who wins it gets the most money, but like runner-up gets money. The guys who made the semifinals and lost get a little bit less. The round of 8 guys get a little bit less. This was just this sort of a goofy, gimmicky idea that IEM came out with, where they're like, what if we just gave the money to the guy who won it and no one else got shit? It's like, well, it's probably not very healthy for the economy of the game. You know, people have flights and shit to pay for. So that was like a one-off thing, and SOS won that. But you might think like, well, SOS, if you were going to do his Immortal game or do a famous SOS match, why not do that one? Well, it was a fucking PvP, okay? And let's be real, PvP is pretty goddamn boring. This is not boring. This is the best player as far as Zergs go in Brood War history, Jaedong, who everybody looked up to, revered, and respected, facing off against our protagonist who just retired from the GSL, SOS. Now, if you're a new fan and you saw SOS's most recent games, you might ask yourself, why is this guy so popular? I don't understand why this guy is held with such reverence or why he's cheered for to such an extent. Because in the GSL, frankly, SOS has never shown his best matches. SOS never won a GSL. In fact, he had an insane reverse sweep choke in his GSL Super Tournament. But what's interesting about this match is, not only is this SOS's Immortal game, and we're already seeing the mind games that he was known for and his ability to play in series come out, opening with a double probe out on the map, super hidden cannon rush. And as far as mind games go, this was just phenomenal, because what we saw was Jaedong hide a worker behind his mineral line to make SOS think, oh yeah, I'm going pool first, I might even be cheesing, I don't want to expand. So SOS didn't block his expo with a pylon, but SOS wasn't fooled, and he got this cannon rush spot down anyway. This was not one of these like super creative, holy shit, pull it out in a special tournament game cannon spots, like that really goofy one pylon block that Parting figured out versus that poor bastard Solar. Everyone knew about this spot, and you could see early on Jaedong was checking for it. So right out the gate, even before we see the Protoss player truly expand, we see something very interesting take place, where the Zerg player is wary of this certain specific aggressive option and is doing everything he can to not let it occur, but it still happens because SOS he didn't send one probe out like it was a ladder game and do a cannon rush. He sent 2 out and intentionally microed the probes in a way that made it seem like he wasn't cannoning, even though Jaedong was incredibly ready for the cannon rush, as far as obviously he was checking the spots and whatnot. So just so fun to see that stuff right out the gate. So back in this time, this was the absolute most entertaining time to ZVP if you were a Protoss player. The meta was for Protoss players to go 4-gate pressure off of 2 base after a multiple century opener, and this was before the Ravager, so Zerg could just be ruthlessly abused by centuries, and there were a lot of different follow-ups you could do with these century openers, as we see SOS very cheekily trying to sneak in another cannon. SOS was one of these Protoss players who could not only cheese but play macro. And whenever I say that, you might think, well, of course, he's like a really good Korean player. No. If you took a scale, and 1 on the scale was the absolute most cheesy thing imaginable, like a C-Jet Galsy type guy who only cannon rushed, or like a Combat X, and the other side of the spectrum at 10 was a guy like Stats or Rain who macroed almost exclusively, SOS is probably one of the only players in StarCraft 2 history that can do the full range of 1 through 10. He can do the ruthlessly, insidiously powerful, aggressive maneuvers, and he can also do the hard macro maneuvers. We can see here the Mothership Core Sentry push-out that I was referring to. This was so standard and so powerful for a few reasons. A, you always want to be pressuring Zerg and forcing them to make attacking units, not drones. B, there was no Ravagers, so if you got into the right spot, got a couple force fields on ramps, you could break bases. And C, the pylon was a 4-second warp in everywhere. You did not have to have a gateway, so very frequently these matches would turn into a game of find the pylon for the Zerg player. And this was at the end of 2013. Heart of the Swarm came out at the beginning of 2013. People were very tired of Wings of Liberty at the end of Wings. This was a very welcome reprieve for the StarCraft 2 scene to have this incredible tournament, and Heart of the Swarm was so much fun when it came out. And Zerg really struggled at the beginning of HOTS. You had Protoss players doing these ridiculous Mothership Core-centric strategies that were so hard to deal with and so punishing. We can see part of what made these strategies difficult to deal with in this game is after opening with a little bit of cheddar to keep Jaedong on the back foot, SOS has intelligently pushed out and made the Zerg player make attacking units. Now this might seem insignificant to you newbie viewers, but really the bread and butter of this matchup is to prevent Zerg from making drones, and really playing against Zerg with any race. That's sort of the crux of the issue, is keeping them from running wild with mass drone. And the Protoss players would do these push-outs, and the force fields made it where it was virtually impossible to get surprised or surrounded, because you had 8 sentries building up energy. You had basically infinity force fields, and then if you could snipe a base or even just do a little light pressure like that and make Zerg make non-drone units, you were in the driver's seat. You were doing your thing, and God forbid if the Zerg didn't scout it or wasn't ready, you would just run over and kill them. And because the Mothership Core had recall, and you had so many sentries, this was very, very low risk. And as TOS, this was so fun to do to Zerg, because it was a very attack-focused metagame. You would do these big push-outs, get what you could done, recall back, make workers for your third. Usually people would go into Robo, they'd get an OBS, make a couple Immortals, and push again. It was very standard and my personal favorite go-to build order in this era, to do this 4-gate push out, and as I took my third, add a Robo, make 3 Immortals and a Prism, and then do a follow-up push. It was just very difficult to deal with the Zerg without the Ravager. A lot of people think of the Ravager as like a cheesy unit. People will like proxy a hatch out at your third, make proxy Ravagers and bile your pylons or add-ons down, or they'll do other abusive stuff with Ravagers or like snipe tanks with them. Really the thing that the Ravager did for Zerg was make it where the Zerg couldn't just be ruthlessly abused by force field. In this era we saw an exceptional amount of force field abuse take place. Very difficult to deal with as Zerg, and from this tournament, which was at the end of 2013, this was the WCS finals, quote unquote, where Europe, America, and Korea were supposed to send their best representatives to compete in this absolutely incredible, interesting tournament at the end of the year. Think like a BlizzCon. Well, when Blizzard did their shit tier ripoff of Riot's LCS, they didn't actually do any region locking. So the way that Blizzard pitched it was like, yeah, we're sort of gutting the private land scene, but at the end of the year we'll have this BlizzCon with like TLO and Idra and Damaga and Innovation. It'll be like BWC or WCS, and because they didn't region lock it, it was 15 Koreans and Naniwa in the finals. It was just total fraud by Blizzard. And you have to consider at the end of Wings of Liberty, they left that game in a shit state and allowed it to go super far downhill, and then they did this, which really screwed the foreign scene over because of its poor implementation. This was a big reason why StarCraft 2 went from the most viewed game on Twitch TV, and it wasn't close, to going a little bit downhill and suffering in viewership. And this is one thing people don't really talk about or consider, was how terrible the rollout of this was. And Artosis actually referred to this era as, quote, when Blizzard was like trying to kill the game. That's not what he said verbatim. I think what he said verbatim was that was when people were basically trying to kill StarCraft. He didn't name Blizzard, but obviously that's who he was talking about. And the metagame that we saw develop was sort of a play on the Wings of Liberty metagame, where people would go Roach Hydra and Wings, but they would run into these Colossus armies. Then they try to make terrible corruptors, as we see Zealots doing real damage to this base here. Jaedong attacking with all of his drones, transfusing, pulling Zealots away, doing absolutely everything to try to hold this, and holy crap, he barely does. And Zerg players, or really any StarCraft player, if your base is that low and there's a Warp Prism still on the map, you bet your bottom dollar they're going to be coming after that motherfucker again. So bring one of your queens from your main or natural over, transfuse it, and leave some army there, because within 2 minutes they are going to try to kill that. It doesn't matter what league you're in. When a structure gets that low, it's just too tempting to go back in for. Pylons warped in 4 seconds everywhere. This was a absolutely massive part of the metagame, both for Terran and Zerg. And look at this, Jaedong intelligently slaps down another Transfuzzle or two and left some roaches behind. There were no lurkers at this time, so you couldn't just like leave a couple lurkers at each base. And it was of course so common for the Zerg just to get everything and attack, try to break the toss with everything, these big Roach Hydra Viper pushes. And the Vipers, of course, were used to pull the money units, the Colossi especially, as Jaedong's going into double Spire here. A really common metagame theme here was to open for this Roach Hydra Viper mix, and then do a big fight, trade off a ton of your army, kill a base, pull a couple Colossi like this, and then be double upgrading Spire at home and do a big Muta switch, go into like 30 Muta. So in Wings of Liberty, the standard ground macro style that we saw Idra really pioneer and do a lot was max out on Roach Hydra and attack, like we saw Jaedong do this game. And it was actually really shitty. It was Stefano who discovered that like that style was like really bad and really easy to deal with and hold this toss. And the real way to go was double upgrade Ling and Fester into Broodlord. And that was the start of the Broodlord and Fester era in mid-2012, whenever Blizzard did the patch that made the Queen better. The range on the Queen went from 3 to 5, meaning that Zerg could make a lot of Queens and it would be like the defensive backbone of the race. Now we see, yeah, you can never have enough Queens. Everybody loves Queens. Before, when the Queen was garbage for the first year and a half of Wings of Liberty, Zergs wouldn't make a lot of extra Queens because they had 3 anti-ground range, so they were shitty for defense. What this equated to was Zerg was much more fragile. Playing standard macro Zerg, it was way easier to overdrone and die. Now, think about TVZ now in Legacy of the Void. Zerg players have a shitload of Queens, and anytime Terran does a mid-game push, there's like 6 forward Queens getting ready to defend, whether it's Hellbat or Marine 221, whatever it is, the Queen is really the backbone of defensive macro Zerg. And that patch in 2012 also made the Overlord faster, so Zerg could scout better and they could defend better. And this was sort of the genesis of the Zerg being strong era at the end of Wings of Liberty, the infester era you hear bitched about frequently. And yes, it was powerful, but really what made it so bad was that if Zerg was going to go for this infester style, which was clearly better than the terrible Roach Hydra style that Idra favored, was it would turn into these really awful, ostentatious Turtle Fest games that were really unwatchable. A strategy can be really strong and almost crushing in some ways, but if it sucks to watch, if you can't attack and you're basically just sitting on a forest of spines, that actually makes it way worse than just something being imbalanced in an aggressive way. SOS has tried multi-prong harass here. He's hiding pylons out on the map, which is something that whenever the pylon warp-in time got nerfed, Protoss players really stopped doing, which is silly because you always want to have an option. You always want to be able to backdoor or counterattack your opponent in a strategy game. And with TOS, obviously, having proxy pylons out on the map is nice because you're not always going to have your prism out. Your prism's going to die sometimes. And the big difference between, we see nice little storms here. SOS wants to get those High Templar out on the ledge and get feedbacks off. He doesn't want to get his Colossi yoinked. Notice he's right on that little fucking corner of that ledge because he knows Jaedong wants to run up with the Vipers. This was when feedback did a lot more damage. Feedback now is not as good as it used to be. Feedback back in this era, if you feedback something, you fucking zapped it and it died. And what happened was Protoss players got so good at using feedback that Zergs really couldn't use Vipers or Infestors, and that's why they nerfed it. But it was sort of funny because in this era, what would happen, especially in Jaedong's games, is he would go into this Roach Hydra just like it was Wings, but instead of going Roach Hydra, seeing Colossi and being like, oh crap, time to make Corruptors, which are the worst unit in the game, you could go Viper. And that was sort of like the Zerg tier 3, the Zerg answer. Because there were no lurkers at this time. So you couldn't like go Roach Hydra and then like, okay, I'll make 11 lurkers and force his hand. No, it didn't work like that. Very interesting era to watch and play the game, because not only was everyone really excited and it was fresh, because remember at the end of Wings of Liberty people were so tired of it. As soon as the beta came out, nobody touched Wings again. And this is great multi-prong drop harass here. This is the sort of thing that stands up even to this day. You run in with Zealots one spot, the Zerg diverts their attention there. You get some worker harass over in another spot. Notice that there's an incredible amount of spines up in the top right. SOS clears the mineral line anyway. And then you warp prism the main. This is the sort of stuff that is applicable and very good up until this day. Years and years later. So because this was the end of 2013 and sort of the culmination of the entire year, Blizzard had pitched it like, oh yeah, this is going to have like Idra, Damaga, TLO, Stefano, MVP, Innovation, and it'll be like basically a culmination of all the regions. Like WCG was in Brood War, and BWC was in 2012. Well, they fucked up the execution of it so badly that, again, you had 15 Korean guys in Naniwa, and Naniwa had to win a tiebreaker versus Revival to even get in this. So this is a great example of why the scene continued to falter and lose viewers from the Broodlord Infestor era all the way until 2014, where basically Blizzard was trying to kill the game, as Artosis said. This was that really retarded thing where Blizzard wanted to big dick and be like, it's not called GSL, it's called WCS Korea. It is, again, the Protoss player really using their spellcasters fantastically here. Jaedong trying to get something done by muscling in, but good storms there really prevent it from happening. Beautiful job to punch in there with the Void Ray and take out the weak base. SOS really showing his understanding of being able to hit in one spot, distract, force multitask, and really understanding the basics of StarCraft in the sense of you only have so much army and your army can only be in so many places at once, because a great macro Zerg like Jaedong, if you let him get on this ridiculous economy, you know what he's going to do? He's going to be able to wear you down. So harassment, such a valuable part of this style of play, and look how long the range on that Nexus cannon is. It fucking goes down to the third. That's ridiculous. The very common strategy, of course, was the Muta switch, where you didn't really have the Lurker or the Broodlord Infestor like you had in Wings of Liberty, the Broodlord Infestor that is. The Lurker didn't exist until HOTS. So what Zergs would do, they would go into these late game armies with whatever it was. They would try to kill out and trade the TOS army, and then go into Mutas with double upgrade Spire. But the Spires have been killed. This was always so brutal whenever you're like, I'm going to go Muta. I'm going to do a big Muta switch. And they killed your Spire, and it's like, and I can't make anything that I want to make. SOS, going for an intelligent base trade, noticed that he was harassing Jaedong the entire game, and then whenever they started a base trade, he mixed in a few DTs. Again, it's something that ages all the way up until today. He's pretty much killed the entirety of Jaedong's main. He's punched out his natural, his third, and his fourth. Only these paltry exterior bases are still alive for Jaedong. And this is the sort of tactical thinking that I'm talking about. Jaedong was such a brilliant macro player and also had very good micro, which is phenomenal overall. Him and Flash were the two most hyped guys coming from the Brood War scene into HOTS. Remember, those guys didn't switch until HOTS came out. Kespa wouldn't let them. So this was really the culmination of everything. We had the player base fracture off. You had MVP go to freaking Europe. Basically, a lot of the Koreans in GSL looked around and said, well, GSL's the hardest tournament in the world, and like 50 S-class Gosus from Brood War coming over. I'll just go play in fucking WCS Europe or WCS America. And it was honestly really lame. Because, yeah, you got to see like Stefano versus MVP in a finals of a WCS Europe, but that was so very obviously and clearly not the intention of Blizzard to have it work like that, where America and Europe were basically just like Code B. It's just so goofy and awful, the execution of Blizzard to try to do a sort of insipid Riot Games ripoff and fuck it up so badly. I remember on one of those talk shows, either State of the Game or that other one that everybody liked, Inside the Game, whenever they announced this, like, yeah, we're doing WCS, we're gonna fuck up the the good old LAN format that everybody loved, where there was a LAN like every weekend and you always had something to look forward to. Like, we're not going to do that, we're too cool for that, we're going to like rip off Riot and do WCS, as we see the Protoss player doing a absolutely beautiful surround and taking game 1. SOS, great job there to keep Jaedong on the back foot all game, defend Jaedong's attacks. Remember, Jaedong attacked at like 200 supply to 130, and the harassment was so persistent and powerful that Jaedong was sort of picked apart and continuously forced to retreat. Just a masterclass from SOS there, really understanding the core mechanics of ZVP, which is attack in one place, force the army back, and then go into another and get more damage done. And if you do that all game, you are going to put yourself in a great position to win, even against the Tyrant. It's very interesting to see these old maps, because people don't ever think of these maps, Akalon Waste, Derelict Watcher, as like really nostalgic fun maps, sort of like a Lost Temple or a Metalopolis or anything like that. But I remember playing like a shitload of ladder on these maps. I think that the beginning of HOTS was probably one of the most exciting and electric eras, because you had this incredible confluence of events where all the God tier players were coming over. Jesus fucking Christ. All the God tier players were not only coming over, we're seeing another cannon rush here. This is freaking brilliant. Remember, no Ravager, and it's a behind the mineral line 2-wall off. Sick. Oh, look at this. Look how abusive this is. Incredible. But it was so amazing, because like I said, people were so tired of Wings, and you put yourself in this position where Wings was great, but at the end of it, people were so tired of it and were all in on the Heart of the Swarm beta. And when HOTS came out, there were all these new exciting tools to deal with, and all these new God tier players that were already established legends from Brood War coming over. And again, a double probe cannon rush out here for SOS. This one was a little bit more in your face and direct, whereas the other one, there was a lot more like guile and cloak and dagger involved. This was just like a straight up Galsy in your face style cannon rush. Jaedong, remember, was this guy who was always rivals with Flash. And Flash and Jaedong was sort of like Red Sox Yankees and Brood War. It was the two biggest names, the two baddest motherfuckers, and they seemed to always face each other in the finals. And when everyone saw, okay, all these Brood War legends are coming over, Flash and Jaedong and Bisu are going to be the best. And we didn't really see that. In this era, this 2013 era, Jaedong went to a bunch of finals and always had these agonizingly close series in the finals, but really struggled to get it done. Same thing with Flash, and it's not like they never won anything, but they did make a lot of finals and find themselves on the losing end, where a lot of people would have sat there and said to themselves, if you had asked them in, like, say 2012 at the end of Wings, like, oh yeah, Flash and Jaedong are going to be in 5 finals combined next year, like how many will they win, assuming they don't face each other, and people would have said 4 or 5 because they were considered that good. So this was such a great time to be a StarCraft fan, and unfortunately Blizzard really shit the bed and fucked this up in every conceivable way. It's just like Idris said on that show whenever they announced this, and then Idris just said to himself and on the show, like, well, they're going to hard region lock it, aren't they? Because there would be literally no point in doing this if they didn't. And in classic Blizzard fashion, like, no, we're not. So they made all these sacrifices, and they basically were overbearing and wanted there to be less lands, and this is the focus, WCS. It's like a weekly thing. And what ended up happening was they essentially took an established product that everybody liked, GSL, and were like, okay, you guys have got to do way less GSLs. Back in 2011 and 2012, there were like 8 GSLs a year, guys. It was, and like for 2011, it was a monthly thing, like GSL January, like GSL March, like there were so many of them. Now we get 2 or 3. When did that start? It started when jerk-off Blizzard wanted to be Riot Games, and they took this established god-tier product with an incredible amount of name recognition, the GSL, the gold standard for StarCraft 2. They were like, you guys are going to rebrand WCS Korea. And people might complain about Blizzard now, like, oh, we don't get any patches, Blizzard doesn't care about StarCraft 2, all this stuff. Well, Blizzard had their hand in the cookie jar and were fucking it up back in this era, so it's one of those be careful what you wish for type things. And Jaedong here, it looks like he's going to try to go into double upgrades. He's banking up a lot of gas, and we see again a little bit of pressure coming out here for the Protoss player. And with the Mothership Core, there was no reason not to do this. You could always get a little bit of an edge. Even if you killed absolutely nothing, you could pressure the creep and force attacking units. And SOS is going to go into 2-star here, which was considered a relatively abusive build. And SOS, we can see, one of the things that he always did well was keeping pressure on. And not just versus Zerg, where it's like the backbone of the matchup. Even against Terran, he really understood what it took to keep the Terran on the back foot as far as build orders go, and the successive things you could do within a series to maximize the potency of things. And Jaedong's really been on the back foot the whole game, as well as game 1. He can't even take his damn natural. And one interesting thing that I think is that because the ramp up time in Heart of the Swarm was slower, you didn't start with as many workers, you know, even though the minerals lasted way longer. That actually favored TOS, weirdly. You think it might favor Zerg, not really, because Zerg wants to keep expanding because of the larva mechanic. TOS sitting on 3 bases is sitting pretty because they can do one push after another, and without Ravagers and with the Mothership Core, you're sitting there to yourself as Zerg, like, it just felt like TOS could push you so many times, and no matter what you did or how many you held, it felt like they could just come at you with another push, come at you with another push. And I felt like this really favored SOS's style because the guy hasn't really stopped attacking the entire either game 1 or 2. He's always pushing out and pressuring. Legacy of the Void ramps up so fast that it seems like you freaking start with 40 workers sometimes. This ramp up, the mid game, the decisions you make in the mid game, like, do I warp in 4 more zealots and attack at my cannon entrenchment, or do I go out to take my 3rd? These are decisions that you don't really face nearly as much in Legacy because of how rapidly things scale up and just sort of how the metagame has fleshed out. And we can see here just an incredibly entertaining game, constant action, a constant back and forth, and the Protoss player, it looks like he's going for a dedicated air mix as he's throwing down the fleet beacon. and he could of course get Phoenix range because that upgrade came out in late Wings of Liberty. A big part of the metagame in HOTS was, okay, well, you did a ground-based army of Zerg, have a Spire in the background, do a big droopy Muta switch. Well, the reason that that came about is the focus of Stargate play, because in Wings of Liberty, the meta for like 2011 was mass Muta. That was before people discovered like Infestors. You beat TOS with mass Muta. And the TOS didn't have a lot of answers for that, especially because it was a very robo-centric meta, and Blizzard came out with that range Phoenix upgrade that gave them an answer. And that's when we saw the rise of Stargate play. You open with the Phoenix, you hunt Overlords, and then you can go into more Phoenix. People would get 4 so they could pick up the Queen and kill it. And that was how the metagame really developed, was these Phoenix openers would occur, and they weren't just for map control and drone control into 4 spines and maybe Hydras, but it made it where you couldn't just die to Muta. Like, surprise Mutas are the fucking worst. It doesn't even matter if you play Zerg. Like, yeah, the Spore is like the best thing in the game against Mutas, but holy crap, like the last thing any StarCraft player wants to see is 15 Mutas flying to their base and they not know. And SOS would do abusive little things like this little cannon entrenchment that you really wouldn't see from a lot of Korean players, even guys like Parting. You think of Parting now, he plays the same way he did back in this era. Cheesy, abusive, aggressive, micro-based, but the level of abuse wasn't there for most other TOS players at this time. Like your Reigns, your Deers, your guys like this, you really wouldn't see this like sort of cloak and dagger, downright and dirty, almost something you would expect from like a foreigner TOS player. Like, oh, even, I hate to bring him up again, because I know a lot of you guys either don't know him or hate him, but Combat X. This was a guy who was insanely abusive and understood the dynamics of the races really well, and really understood in an RTS and in a strategy game how you could get under people's craw and abuse them. You could do a certain aggressive option that forced a response and then go into something brutal. Great example. You go 2 Stargate Phoenix after Cannon Rush where you've split their base up and made it harder to defend. Then you go +1 Zealots, which completely counter Lings. And the Zerg player is not going to want to go Roach when they see 2 Stargate. They can't effectively go Roach and have the gas to defend. So what does SOS do? He does a Ling Buster build with lots of +1 Zealots, goes into 2 Stargate, and if the Zerg player makes Hydras, he dies, because Phoenix do bonus damage to light units. If he goes Muta, he dies, because Phoenix counter Muta. If he goes Corrupt or Ling, which is like pretty much his best option, this is what happens. Notice how Jaedong diligently denied the 3rd, the Protoss is still on 2 base. If you were on 2 base at 16 minutes into a Legacy of the Void game, you'd be completely mined out. You see SOS showing any signs of weakness, he has fucking 1k here. Still hasn't taken a 3rd. This is why they nerfed the mineral patches down and reduced the amount of money in the mineral patches, because Protosses could do these really abusive, in-your-face, extended 2 base plays versus Zerg, and if they took a quick 3rd, forget about it, you would just seemingly endlessly push. The metagame at this time was really focused around preventing the TOS from taking a 3rd. And if you were TOS, it was about keeping the Zerg on the back foot, and we can see there, the game was constant fucking action, and this is a best of 5 for all the marbles, which again, you can see why Artosis referred to this era as whenever they tried to kill the game on purpose. You have a World Finals, a BlizzCon tier Finals where everything is on the line and it's supposed to be a culmination of everything. Well, I'm just kidding, it's a best of 7. But the semi-finals were best of 5. I misspoke a bit there. The finals were best of 7, but the semi-finals were best of 5. Think about how many like GSL semifinals would be fucked up if they did best of 5. I can think of a lot of GSL round of 4 matches where, yeah, thank God they're fucking best of 7. You really should be playing best of 7s in the round of 4 and on. So the fact that this was BlizzCon in the finals, the grand finals of an entire year's worth of tournaments where there's a seeding system for all over the world and only 16 guys make it. It should be best of 7 all the way through, man. But anyway, SOS was attacking for literally 8 straight minutes there. And I think people who watch Legacy now, like, this sort of feeds into the like low IQ, low impulse control era that we see really eating at people's brains today, where it's like, oh well, the action has to start heckin' immediately. I can't wait till 3 minutes in to see these guys decide which structures they're gonna make. Legacy of the Void, it insta starts up, and people act like that's just like a net linear good for the game. Oh, here's the Reaper coming in to hit the Zerg's 4 Lings. Like, guess what, guys? That's fucking contrived and boring. That's played out. Back in this era, we saw a sort of triangle slash, not necessarily rock, paper, scissors, because that makes it sound like RNG based, but a traditional sort of one thing counters the other, which counters the other in early game Zerg versus Terran, where it was like 2 racks versus Marine Expand versus Reaper. Whereas now it's just Reaper every single game. It's so mapped out, so predictable. Yes, this era was slower to start, but guess what? That means there's more decisions. There's more scouting in the early game. There's more time for stuff to happen. Jesus Christ, in Legacy of the Void, you can send a worker scout out, and it's like, you gotta send it literally right when the game starts. A lot of the time on certain maps if you want to really block something or get aggressive in the early game. And I think that's actually bad for StarCraft, even though it lets people who never actually play the game feel like they're watching like something on Netflix and they can just jump right into the action. There was more of a build-up in this era, and that actually affected the game in ways that people don't really consider. And SOS here didn't go for a cannon rush. This is the biggest macro map there is, Whirlwind. One of the biggest macro maps in StarCraft 2 history, and this was one of the few maps that actually persisted through multiple versions of the game because it was such a good balanced map. This is also a really good Zerg map, by the way. This was the map that if you were a macro Zerg, you picked and hoped you spawned in Cross. But I want you to consider last game, with all the Zealot and Phoenix harass occurring throughout the game, and it having to be a constant thing. It was multiple Zealot attacks, multiple waves, tons of action. You would never see a game like that in Legacy. And people always pretend like, oh, these games back then, these were bad games. This looks like a Silver League game now. A common refrain from people that play in Silver League now, you know. It's like, it's so sick to see how dismissive and nasty people can be about these old style of games, and it's like, well, you're talking shit about it, but you couldn't even tell the difference between one of these games and a Legacy game if I dropped you into it at 5 minutes and none of the Legacy units were used. And also, like, anytime you see someone be like hypercritical of pro gamers, and like not in a casting sense, because you obviously have to point out the mistakes if they happen and be honest, but if you see someone like being really cunty in the comments about like, oh, this is like a Silver League game now, you can just dismiss those people as dim-witted because they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Unless it's like an early fucking Wings of Liberty game where it's like a true clown show. But up to this point in Heart of the Swarm, people really knew what they were doing. Even though it was a new game, they had about a year to mess with stuff, and this was really high-level games that we saw. Really interesting between god-tier Gosus of the game, and again, the game of hide the pylon / get the pylon down close to the Zerg's base is going to occur, and the aggressive ramp-up has begun. This was always a big part of Heart of the Swarm, and we saw this in Wings of Liberty too, but not to the same extent, where Protosses would always try to hide pylons around the map, and holy shit, speaking of hiding, this is a great example of how SOS understands the map and the metagame, is because they spawn in close positions, and SOS wants to take his third in that sort of 430 position that is just outside that we see right there on the screen, and he realizes it's close positions. Jaedong is probably going to be aggressive. He's going to be making attacking units because I showed him this pylon. So what am I going to do? I'm going to act like that I'm letting him deny my third, when in reality I've taken one in the top left. This is one brutal thing about not having any 4v4 maps, or not 4v4, but 4-player maps rather, in the current ladder pool, as a nice little time warp goes down to prevent the queens from escaping. And Jaedong here is sort of saying to himself, oh crap, I've lost a couple queens, my spore is a bit late, and now that the spore goes down, oh no, things can start to snowball out of control, and unfortunately the TOS player, SOS, does lose a Void Ray because a queen does flank up from the left side, and Jaedong will want to remake a spore immediately. And because the Nexus did not have recall, the Mothership Core had recall, he's not going to be able to make a bunch of probes recall to the top left and start insta-mining. He's going to just have to make probes, like old school hidden base. I don't want him to scout my base style make probes. Twilight coming down, and SOS did something that a lot of Protoss players wouldn't do. He went out and acted like he was taking a third, sort of begrudgingly saying, oh, well, okay, I'll try to take it a little late. And then, oh crap, I'll have to cancel it. Oh no, I'm going to have to cancel my third. And this is the sort of brilliant giving away of misinformation that SOS did that not a lot of other people did. Yes, he does want this third base up in his normal location, but he doesn't expect to hold it. He knows that Jaedong is hell-bent on breaking his third, and that he's going to continue to do so. Like I said, the metagame at this time revolved around breaking the TOS third, because if the TOS got an early third with the way the minerals were, my goodness, it was so difficult. So Jaedong's sitting to himself thinking, I've denied the third a couple times, and even though I'm down 0-2, I'm feeling so heckin' good about myself because I'm finally in the driver's seat. I'm on a good map, and little does he know the TOS player has a hidden base up in the top left. The sort of hiding of bases and hiding of information is something that gets limited with these very, very just banal 2-player maps. Having a 4-player map in the pool is great, and really we should see multiple of those. And again, Jaedong's going to try to come in and deny the third, and what does he do? He's an intelligent player. He's going to fly into one area while he attacks another, and this is StarCraft 101. We saw SOS do it a lot in Game 1. We saw Jaedong do it in this game. He's actually going to get the fucking Twilight when charge is 90% done. That's heckin' amazing. He's also going to go for Twilight here, or the Templar Archives rather, and he's going to narrowly get Storm, as holy crap, Jaedong comes in and picks off both those upgrades beautifully, and then runs in once the army runs back over. See, this is StarCraft 101, folks. Really understand how to force your opponent to multitask and pressure them. This is the difference between just doing like a big dumbass Ling Flood and understanding pressuring your opponent in a location and then attacking an opposite side location and using 2 different unit sets that complement each other. Jaedong doing everything brilliantly, and getting the Templar Archives and the Twilight Council was just jaw-dropping. Gosu stuff, and he's actually making SOS panic. SOS was in the driver's seat and knew exactly what he was doing. God, look how fast Jaedong is with those injects. One of the things that tournaments do in real life when you go to a LAN was they would put both players' FPOV on like the left and right of the main screens. I remember going to MLG Dallas 2013, one of the first major tournaments where all the S-Class Brood War guys came over, and I remember watching like Flash FPOV, Jaedong FPOV. Remember, none of these guys streamed on Twitch or Africa, and I was just freaking floored by how crisp their macro was. It was absolutely jaw-dropping. And even though SOS sort of got the build order mental advantage on Jaedong, due to his incredible micro and very clean macro, is cutting roach speed until now, cutting other upgrades, and then getting out all these lings, and then saving all the gas for the mutas. Jaedong did everything perfect to make it where SOS did have to try to defend that third for real, and then he went in and got game devastating damage done, and is really snowballing the game here. SOS still does not have this third. Now hilariously, Jaedong is thinking to himself pretty much like, oh, I've already won. I've done like insurmountable damage here. I have a huge lead, but the hidden base sort of makes it more even. Although Jaedong is still ahead, of course he already has Hive. He's going into Ultra. This was like a very common Jaedong strat to do. Basically his in-game would always involve Ultras in some capacity, and he loved the Muta switch. And Infestors come out, and the Infestor did do a full snare at this time, but it was a projectile. Later they changed it to a slow, but these Infestors do not do bonus damage to armored units like the Wings of Liberty Infestors. And this was a weird position if you're Protoss, because the Zerg is really just going to try to come in and hammer your third with everything. But we can see Jaedong here fighting with all of his Mutas as well as his Infestor Ling. But when you have this many Phoenix out, we can really see why Phoenix countered Muta, especially with +1. And Jaedong really traded those out for nothing. And he plummets in supply all the way down to 155. And you can say to yourself like, oh, he's just making room for Ultras. Anytime you trade Mutas away, it's a very dangerous thing, because they're so expensive. You work all game building up your Muta count. You're always trying to keep that Muta count up to the max amount possible to pressure your opponent. So when you trade all of them off, not only do you lose the ability to harass like you want to, you lose the ability to deal with air in many ways. Because we see this very common thing where Zergs will like, oh, I'm going to trade off my Muta, they're useless. And then they're sitting to themselves like, oh, I don't have any anti-air. Maybe I shouldn't have given away my Mutas. A telltale sign of if a player is on the back foot as Zerg is if you see him quote-unquote trade away like 15 plus Mutas, and then he makes a single other Muta for the rest of the game. Because Mutas are so expensive, and really the whole point of Mutas is you surprise your opponent with 10 plus and get a really devastating blow done with that reveal. For instance, killing the Twilight and the Templar Archives like in this game, or a whole mineral line in a lot of other games where you don't necessarily able to snipe the tech. Sniping that tech was only predicated off of the fact that he ran the Lings in. And that's when you do the most damage with the Muta. Once they've seen the Muta and have a couple Stargates and can mass Phoenix and even get range, the Mutas lose a lot of their value. But you don't want to be in a position where you trade all that away and then it's like, well, how do I deal with this air? You do have to have a big enough economy and be mining enough to be able to answer that question. And for Jaedong, the answer is going to be Corruptors. And anytime someone hides a base on you, you run into this sort of vexing scenario where it feels like, well, holy crap, how do they have this much stuff? How are they supporting all of this off of 2 base? I cancelled or killed his third like 5 times. How is he still alive? Even with all the minerals in the bases on the Heart of the Swarm maps. And then there's always that sinking feeling if you do discover it. Like, what if in 5 minutes Jaedong goes up to take his freaking 5th base and he's like, oh shit, no wonder I can't kill him. Infested Terran coming down, you love to see it. I almost forgot that upgrade existed. And High Templars, of course, are the counter to the Infestor. They can zone with storms and pop with feedback. And one of the worst things about Corruptors is how weak they are to storm. Any late game Zerg who's like, oh, he's going mass air with Mothership High Templar, I'll make 50 Corruptors, and it's like, oh, I died to 3 storms. Every Zerg's experienced that feeling, and Jaedong's sort of sitting to himself like, well shit, maybe I should have kept the Mutas. And you might be thinking, well, why doesn't he make Vipers here? Well, Parasitic Bomb really wasn't a thing. The Viper was only used for Abduct. No other ability was even considered, unless it was Blinding Cloud versus Mech. And there was this cute little thing that would occur where Vipers would be used for a bust, but we would never see Vipers used in conjunction with Infestors. Never, ever, ever. It was considered too difficult to micro, and no one ever did it. Even now, it's pretty damn rare, and we can see here Jaedong just made a bunch of roaches, even though it's 22 minutes in the game. And the easiest thing to do was just to chain fungal the Zealots over and over. And then after the Zealots got down to no health, have the roaches attack them as they were snared, and then throw out some infested Terran. And the Protoss player is going to say, well shit, I can't hold that, I guess I'll have to counter. Oh, even though SOS in his brilliant mind fooled Jaedong into thinking he was on a delayed 2 base for so long. Jaedong did such a good job and microed and macroed so cleanly where he took the advantage anyway. And a Warp Prism was your best chance for a comeback. We saw the Warp Prism used incredibly in Game 1, but once I love like the Corruptors just infinitely chasing after that non-speed Warp Prism, just hilarious. But the Warp Prism really was your best ticket back, and even in Wings of Liberty at the height of the Broodlord Infestor era, the Warp Prism was the main tool that TOS would use to try to come back. The absolute money shot, money maneuver was to warp in like 15 speed zealots with a couple DTs and snipe the Greater Spire. Another move that like frustrated Zergs would do in this era, like in this situation, was especially if they had crappy units like Roaches and they were really struggling to find like a proper tech unit, they would just attack with their ground and like maybe throw a fungal if your army was there, but then dump all their infestor energy with infested Terrans out. Sort of like the Zerg version of pulling the boys. They'd burn all that infestor energy in a big all-in salvo to try to end the game. And we can see the Protoss really struggling here, and because the Zerg has expanded top left, he can't freaking like bring a probe out top left and expand bottom left, because if a probe comes out of top left and sees this, and the Zerg is like, where did that probe just come from? Is he hiding a pylon up there? Oh, holy shit, there's a base up here. The Protoss doesn't want to give that base away, because as long as the minerals last, it's actually still mining. It's very valuable. It's the only thing keeping SOS in this game. Jaedong sitting here with Broodlords, and the whole reason Broodlord Infestor is good, if you don't know, as we see big feedbacks coming down, is the Broodlords are immobile and struggle with being kited or jumped under, and the Infestors obviously are good at locking stuff in place. Jaedong has a huge bank. He's probably going to micro this fight out, see what the Protoss has army-wise, and if he doesn't have a bunch of Phoenix still, make a shitload of Muta. And there it is. Another intelligent thing that Zergs would do, especially Jaedong specifically, when they would do this like double spire backup plan, like one of the spires would obviously be used for Greater Spire and the other one could be used to upgrade. So this meant that your Broodlords and Corruptors were better, but when you did these big Muta switches, your Mutas would be really well upgraded. And it made them so much harder to deal with. Like +3 Mutas with a couple Carapace upgrades, that's way different than freaking +1 attack Mutas with no Carapace, especially if you've been diligently upgrading yourself. Remember, SOS already has like +2 attack. GG is called there, as you never want to see an absolute like shit stomp beatdown in the finals. What the hell is going on? Looks like we're gonna get another cheddar here. As a cannon rush is going to occur, and this is pretty damn cutesy Q here, because you keep your opponent on the back foot with cannons every game, and then you lose the macro game, and you say, well, fuck it, back to cannons. But is it a true cannon rush? Oh no, that's a cyber core in the production tab, ladies and gents. And this map, Polar Night, was really weird because it had this bizarro backdoor base. Like you see the base in the bottom left and top right. These were sort of like thirds, quote unquote, but we didn't really see nearly any maps like this into the future. This was a very odd design, and there was more experimentation with the Heart of the Swarm maps. You had like weird cutesy rock stuff like this in the third to Acheron Waste, and the map Frost, which is an all-time fucking map, 4-player map with the cute high ground over the third. The maps now are so banal and uninteresting. They're almost always fucking 2-player. The idea of getting zany or cute, you know what it always is? You know what it always comes down to? Some idiot putting minerals, like these little mineral walls, or like rocks. Like, nobody likes that. Like, that's just arduous. Having big mineral lines that block areas of maps or destructible rocks that are like in the middle of maps as opposed to like to get to your third, that stuff is garbage. That stuff bores people. No one likes to see that shit. And I feel like a big reason why StarCraft 2 is feeling sort of stale, it's not just because we haven't had a patch in forever, it's because the map pool is so fucking static. And if even one 4-player map gets put in the pool, the kvetching is off the charts. These StarCraft players will often tell you, like, oh, the game is stale, the game is boring, same thing every time. And then the moment anything changes a little bit, it's non-stop whining. SOS went for in-base gate expand, which was of course abnormal. Noticed in the other matches he was going forge at the front of his base, sort of a Wings of Liberty style forge fast expand. And this was, again, something that I love to see. There was more variance in the early game as far as choices you have. When you look at the games now, unless someone is doing like a full-on committed one base with shield battery cannon rush, do you see a lot of variance in the early game? Do you see a lot of choices? No. It's gate at the front every time, and because the Reaper is so good, you can never go Nexus first. Like, you don't understand how good the Reaper is in terms of, oh, well, that actually just makes it where 80% of the old school, like, eco-greed builds are just auto-loss. Oh, he made one Reaper, okay, I die with Nexus first. Oh, I die with 3 hatch, he made one Reaper. This is an interesting little dynamic that allowed SOS to use his intelligence and his series planning to trick Jaedong. Opens up with Cannon Rush in the first 2 games, then feigns Cannon Rush and goes Gate Expand in this game. Now if you went Gate Expand, you could get Warp Gate quicker as well as your tech quicker. So you might think, well, like, what's the difference between like the Gate Expand now and the Gate Expand then? The Gate Expand now happens every game, so people are used to it, and the timings. The Gate Expand back in this era, it means that 2 Immortals are going to be out way quicker than Jaedong expected, and it makes the variance as far as when the attack hits like 2 minutes earlier. Like a 2 Immortal 2 base all-in is supposed to hit around 10 minutes. Because SOS feigned the Cannon Rush, made Jaedong think he had gone Forge first or Nexus, which would have made this push hit at around 10 minutes, and then hid the Robo in an intelligent spot in his base. Suddenly Jaedong is caught completely off guard, and here comes the Warp Prism. Will we see some Sentry on the ramp abuse? This was like the Zerg's nightmare. My god, I hope he doesn't make 1 Sentry and wall my ramp off. This was another brutal thing to deal with as Zerg. The double time warp, SOS doing an all-in here, crushing forward with Zealots, saying, recall, who needs it? I'm completely all in. I'm going to back you up to the corner of your base, because you might see like, oh, slow Zealots, no Sentry, like, can't the Zerg run away? Yeah, where to? When you get to the guy's base and he's already walled up, cornered in, time warp behind a mineral line, the Zerg can't do anything. And I really want to point out all the little steps that made that push work. That was not Jaedong being sloppy and just fucking dying. In fact, it was the opposite. Every little thing that SOS did in this series predicated that push working. Okay? It was the reason the push worked. The push working and working that well was predicated off of the opening builds. The cannon rushes made the feigned cannon rush at the beginning of this game more powerful, okay? The hidden base last game, even though it didn't work and Jaedong still won because he got the mutas in, that was SOS setting Jaedong up. This is a guy that understands how to get in people's head and use the strategies shown earlier in the series to benefit himself and trick the other person. Because Jaedong's thinking, okay, he's going Forge or Nexus first every game, which was pretty standard at the time. You would see Gate Expand, but the Gate Expand timings were completely different from the non-Gate Expand timings. So when he shows up with that double Immortal 2 base all-in, it's like, this is hitting 2 minutes earlier than I expected, with 2 more Immortals than I expected, and I'm fucking time warped. So here's the map that I love, Frost, and is the VOD gonna end here? What the fuck? Is it really gonna like cut off? Let's see. Look at this fucking bullshit. Absolutely awful. So obviously SOS goes on to win the final map, and I fucking found it because I'm Gosu, so here we go. Look how good I am picking that shit up on the fly. That's part of why I thought that it was best of 5 all the way through, was the timing of that VOD. And, well, just the fact that they were fucking everything up at the time, seemingly. And you might be wondering, Venom, where's your boy, innovation and all this? TOS was so good from this tournament all the way through 2014 that he actually lost, and my boy Innovation lost to this no-name fucking cheesy TOS player named Duck Duck, who, even though we saw god-tier guys like Polt and MVP who were in the GSL go over to WCS America and Europe and dominate, we also saw Korean players who weren't that good or we had never heard of, or were like your lesser-known Brood War guys. They came over and shit all over NA in Europe too. Which you might be saying, well, like shouldn't it just be like best player versus best player? Yeah, but Blizzard didn't need to step in and force feed everyone all this crap and do the whole butchered WCS. If they had rolled it out properly, we would have essentially seen the best players anyway. Or what would have happened would have been you could have had a BlizzCon style tournament where you had everyone in their element and you had the best players based on a point system that favored WCS less heavily. But I digress with that, because SOS is absolutely brilliant, and this video really is about SOS's ability to series plan and not like how stupid Blizzard was back in 2013. But you've got to understand, when HOTS first came out, everyone was looking forward to seeing how these guys would perform, and we can see in-base Forge here. So of course it was completely standard to open with a Forge, but it was out at your natural to help you wall. So in the first 2 games, SOS says, here's my Forge, I'm going to cannon you. And then in this game, he fakes with the Forge, hides it inside, and makes it look like he's doing gate expand. And see, what you might not be noticing here with all of this is all these little intricate moves that SOS does to fool Jaedong and to position himself to get the early game advantage and mental advantage would not be possible in Legacy because it ramps up so fast. That's a big reason why I think SOS's PvZ has really fallen off, and Artosis would always say for like the last 3 years of SOS's career, I love his PvT, his PvP's smart, but I really don't like his versus Zerg. And I think whenever the game sped up and it got to like, oh, Zerg is at like so many drones so fast, and the game gets to this point with such rapidity that SOS, he really lost what made him powerful, which was the ability to pull mind games, show certain information, whether it be on purpose to deceive or on purpose to just say, oh yeah, I am doing this just like before, so you better react to it. And then the Zerg might think that, oh, he's being tricky, and then, oh no, I'm actually doing it all in. Basically, everything that SOS has done in this series has led up to another moment. And a Stargate opener will occur here for SOS. He's going Phoenix. Got the Sentry out. And I really think the shield battery is like a fucking cancer to StarCraft 2. Whether it be used aggressively or defensively. A good litmus test for how good something is in StarCraft is it fun to play with or against? And if the answer is no for both, then it's fucked. The Swarm Host is a great example of this. The Swarm Host is an unfun cancer unit that is brutally unfun to play against, and it's not fun to play with either. And we can see SOS waiting until the Overlord passed to hide his gate. So Jaedong's like, are you taking a fast third? And remember, Jaedong never found that third in that Whirlwind game. So he's looking around the map now, and Violet came in and probably talked to him and was like, oh, we hit a third in that game. I don't know if you know that, but there also, in this era, whenever a game ended, there was no like quit and rewind feature. So in tournaments, if someone did something like that, and like you just GG'd out, there were some tournaments that were like, you can't look at the replay in between games, and you couldn't just quit by hitting like GGing, hitting F10 and hitting quit and rewind, and it's showing you the whole map, you know, and being like, oh, he had a hidden base. So hypothetically, if Jaedong like didn't have the ability to have people like come in and talk to him in between matches, he probably would have never known. Just something to consider, because now every single time when someone leaves a tournament game, they do it with like quit and rewind, because they just want to see like the map without fog of war at the end. In the same way that like if you know you're dead with Terran, you might like scan all the exterior bases to see like, well shit, how many bases is he on before you leave? That never happens now. You know, if a guy's sitting there losing, he's just gonna say, okay, quit and rewind, be like, oh, okay, that's what he had, that's how much army he had. But Zealots are going to scream in here. Jaedong is caught completely off guard. I don't think he realized the depth and brevity and ferocity of this push. Remember, he failed to scout the gateways. He ran in with an overlord just a second ago and didn't see enough gates to have this many Zealots. Again, hiding your buildings in a certain way, showing information, knowing when a guy will scout, what you want him to see based on what you want to do. A lot of Protoss players will just go through the motions, do their build, get their buildings as quick as possible, and go from there. You know, SOS had that Phoenix out pretty damn quick, and he knows where the Zerg wants to put his overlords. Could he have prevented that overlord scout more quickly? Probably. Did he intentionally let it fly in to show off certain information? Sure. And we can see throughout this series, SOS, whenever he does something, it always feeds into something else. He does the cannon rush on Daedalus Point, and then does a strategy with Zealot Phoenix that really crushes people who have split defense and don't have all their bases connected by creep. He does the cannon rush in the first two games and then feigns a cannon rush later, essentially incurring an early game advantage and doing a super sharp timing, where after it looks like, oh, he's trying to cannon rush me and I held it, lol, he must be behind. Well, oh shit, he actually went gate expand, and the robo's quicker, the warp gate's quicker, everything is 2 minutes quicker, which in StarCraft against a brutal all-in is everything. So this was a truly brilliant performance here by SOS, and this game really shows why he was so good and what made him an elite level player and a multi-time tournament winner. And even though he never won a GSL, this guy was an absolute monster and really understood how Protoss was supposed to be played. And I think in Legacy of the Void, the reason he struggled a bit and was a little inconsistent is because of the ramp-up time. It didn't give nearly as much opportunity for head games, and you were sitting there going into a third base so fucking quickly, where a lot of times it felt like, oh, the Zerg doesn't even really have to scout me or make a read. He can get up to so many workers so quick where the onus is on me to do something. As opposed to now, it's more of a gradual, steady climb, a give and take, a back and forth. We can see SOS running around, harassing, and getting vision of that high ground. That high ground, by the way, that we saw him send a Zealot up to, so good for putting cannons up there. Or like Terrans, if you spawn close positions, like where Jaedong is and then bottom left is Terran. Terrans would do like these absolutely sickening pushes up there with tanks over your third. And God forbid if they were smart enough to bring a couple SCVs, maybe throw a bunker and a turret down. So abusive. So hard to deal with. But these little quirky features on these maps make them more entertaining and fun to watch. You know what's not fun to watch? A map with like 4 sets of destructible rocks autistically placed throughout the middle and a bunch of mineral patches to mine through. That's just arduous. No one enjoys those maps or breaking down a bunch of sets of rocks to get a map to flow. Maps like this, like Akalon Waste, Frost, these are like good, down and dirty RTS maps that have flow and character. The maps that we see now, it doesn't matter how many fucking rocks you put on them, it doesn't make them any less cookie cutter. And thank God GSL is using a 4-man map that they made up. Of course it gets freaking perma-vetoed by the pro gamers almost all the time, but you really do see a lot of variety lost with the ramp up times being changed. A hallucinated Colossus being used there. The mothership core goes down. Jaedong might try to attack into this. He is going for the absolutely terrible Wings of Liberty centric Roach-Hide to Corruptor, and we can see why this strategy was so abominable and why Idra hated ZVP so much, as the Colossi mow fucking everything down, embarrassing, and I mean embarrassing, the army. And let's just watch it again here at the end, folks, because might be asking, well, why did Zergs elect to go for Vipers, tech all the way up into Hive, and not just do Corruptors? It's because of this. The Protoss army, and the Colossi especially, even if you make fucking 10 Corruptors, you're gonna get your shit mowed down and eviscerated before the TOS loses their army. And you know what's even filthier? Even if you do kill it, you're left with a bunch of shitty Corruptors. The Corruptor is the worst unit in the whole game. And Jaedong really didn't play bad in the series. He diligently scouted, he macroed hard and well, he kept his money down, and look at this, he's maxed. Again, like way before the Protoss, Jaedong has a max army, he already has stuff to do with the Colossi, it's Corruptor, not Viper this time, and just like any intelligent player, I'm on my mid-game army, time to attack. The other player has 50 less supply than me, and look at this. Perfect focus fire on the Corruptors, but look at how those Hydras just turn into little fireballs. And SOS just completely dominated this finals with intelligent play, and not just intelligent play like, oh, he figured out one really good build order, lol. He understood how to plan for a series. And the fact that SOS has retired is a huge blow to the StarCraft scene, because even though there are very good Protoss players still left in the scene, they don't think about the game in the same way as SOS. So this was a great guy that we're really going to miss. And I know I reflected a lot on like Blizzard in 2013 and all that stuff, but you guys have eyes, you can see what's going on in the game. It is action packed, and there is actually so much action in these old style games where if I stop to like do like the, oh my god, he's coming in with like that sort of casting in this old game where you could sort of deduce the results already based on the fact that it's SOS's Immortal game, then you know what, I never would have been able to make any point or talk about what units were available, how popular muta transitions were and stuff like that. So make sure you sub for more StarCraft videos. Easy.